Driving down a dark, deserted highway late at night, I spotted an old man standing by the roadside, his small bag slung over his shoulder. Something about him seemed off, but against my better judgment, I stopped and offered him a ride. He said little, his words as guarded as his eyes. Out of kindness, or maybe curiosity, I let him stay the night at my house. But the next morning, he sat me down, looked me in the eye, and said, "I have lied to you." What he revealed next turned my world upside down. The hum of the engine and the steady rhythm of rain against the windshield were my only companions that night. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, flanked by dense woods that seemed to close in on either side. It was the kind of road where your thoughts grew louder, amplified by the isolation. For me, it was a night of restless reflection. Work deadlines, unpaid bills, and a recent argument with my sister playing on an endless loop in my head. It was nearing midnight, and my goal was simple: get home, collapse into bed, and deal with everything tomorrow. But that plan changed when I saw him. A figure emerged in the headlights, standing just off the shoulder of the road. At first, I thought it might have been a trick of the light or a shadow from the trees. But as I got closer, the figure became clearer. A hunched old man, wearing a rain-soaked coat and clutching a small, battered bag. He raised his hand in a slow, deliberate motion, a weak attempt to flag me down. Instinctively, my foot hovered over the brake. My heart raced, torn between caution and guilt. The highway was deserted, no other cars in sight, and the rain was unrelenting. What kind of person would leave an elderly man stranded in this weather? Yet, every crime show I'd ever seen flashed through my mind. Picking up a stranger in the middle of nowhere wasn't exactly the safest choice. "Just keep driving," I muttered to myself, gripping the steering wheel. But as I passed him, I caught a glimpse of his face illuminated in the headlights. It wasn't desperation I saw. It was something quieter, more resigned, like he didn't expect anyone to stop. Against my better judgment, I pulled over. I reversed the car slowly, the tires crunching on the wet gravel. Lowering the passenger side window, I called out, "Hey there, are you all right?" The man stepped closer, his face now visible in the glow of the interior light. His skin was weathered, his eyes tired but kind. His hair, a mix of white and gray, clung to his forehead in damp strands. "I'm fine," he said, his voice soft and hoarse. "Just trying to get to the next town." His answer was vague, but the rain was coming down harder now, and I couldn't leave him there. "Hop in," I said, unlocking the door. "I'll give you a ride." He hesitated for a moment before opening the door and climbing in. As he settled into the seat, clutching his bag tightly, I noticed his hands were trembling, whether from the cold or something else, I couldn't tell. "Thanks," he murmured, glancing at me briefly before staring straight ahead. "No problem," I replied, though the knot in my stomach said otherwise. "I'm James, by the way." "Walter," he said simply, offering no further details. The next 20 minutes passed in near silence. Walter didn't seem inclined to talk, and I didn't push him. Every now and then, I'd steal a glance at him out of the corner of my eye. His clothes were worn but clean, his bag small enough to suggest he didn't have much to his name. "Where are you headed?" I finally asked, breaking the silence. "Just the next town," he repeated. His vague answers only deepened my curiosity. Why was he out here alone in the middle of the night? Where was his family? Did he even have one? I didn't press further. Instead, I focused on the road, the wipers squeaking rhythmically as they fought against the rain. When we reached the outskirts of the next town, I slowed the car and turned to Walter. "Do you have somewhere to stay tonight?" Walter hesitated, his eyes flickering with something I couldn't quite place. Shame, maybe, or pride. "I'll figure it out," he said. The thought of dropping him off on a night like this didn't sit right with me. It wasn't much, but I had a spare room at my place. I wasn't sure why, but something about Walter made me trust him, despite his evasiveness. "If you need a place to stay, I've got a guest room," I offered. "It's not much, but it's warm, and it beats wandering around in this weather." Walter looked at me for the first time since he'd gotten in the car, his tired eyes searching mine. "Are you sure?" he asked. "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile. "It's no trouble." He nodded, the faintest hint of relief crossing his face. "Thank you." As we drove through the small, sleepy town, the streetlights cast long, flickering shadows on the wet pavement. Walter sat quietly beside me, his hands folded over his bag, his gaze fixed on something distant, beyond the windshield. The rain had lightened, but the air was still heavy with mist, giving the town an eerie stillness. I slowed the car as we passed the local motel, a dingy building with a faded neon sign that flickered unevenly. I glanced at Walter, hoping he might indicate this was his stop, but he didn't so much as glance at the building. "Were you planning to stay here?" I asked, gesturing toward the motel. Walter shook his head. "No," he said softly. "I don't have the money for a place like that." The admission hung in the air between us, heavy and awkward. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, unsure of what to say. He didn't offer anything else, just sat there, staring out at the rain-slicked streets. I felt a pang of guilt. It wasn't his fault he was out here alone, and it wasn't right for me to just leave him without a roof over his head. Still, the idea of inviting a complete stranger into my home gave me pause. I thought about the photos of my family on the walls, the spare room that still had some of my sister's belongings from her last visit, and the faint creak in the floorboards upstairs that always made the house feel less empty. Could I really trust him? Before I could second-guess myself, the words were out of my mouth. "If you don't have anywhere to stay, you can crash at my place tonight," I said, my tone casual, to mask my own unease. "It's not far from here, and it beats staying out in the cold." Walter turned his head slowly, his expression unreadable. "You don't have to do that," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "I know I don't," I replied, "but I want to. Everyone needs a little help now and then." For a moment, he didn't say anything. His fingers tightened slightly around his bag, and his eyes flickered with something I couldn't quite place. Relief, maybe, or apprehension. Finally, he nodded. "Thank you," he said simply. The drive to my house was short, but the silence between us stretched, thick with unspoken tension. I kept sneaking glances at Walter, trying to piece him together like a puzzle. His clothes were worn but clean, his face lined with age, but not neglect. He didn't look like someone who had lived on the streets for long, but there was a weight in his posture, like a man carrying a burden too heavy to share. When we pulled into my driveway, the porch light cast a warm glow over the small 2-story house. It wasn't much, but it was home. Walter stared at it for a moment, his expression unreadable. "You live here alone?" he asked as we stepped out of the car. "For now," I said, grabbing my bag from the back seat. "My sister stays over sometimes, but mostly it's just me." He nodded but didn't comment further. I led him up the porch steps and unlocked the door, motioning for him to follow me inside. The familiar creak of the hardwood floor greeted us as I flipped on the lights. The house was modest, with a cozy living room filled with mismatched furniture and bookshelves crammed with old paperbacks. Family photos lined the walls. Me with my parents at a lake, me and my sister laughing at some long-forgotten joke, and a few candid shots from holidays past. Walter's eyes lingered on the photos for a moment before he turned to me. "This is a nice place," he said, his voice low. "Thanks," I replied, setting my keys on the table. "Make yourself at home. I'll grab some towels and blankets for you." I went upstairs to the linen closet, grabbing a stack of clean towels and a spare blanket. As I passed by the spare room, I hesitated, peering inside. The room was tidy but bare, the bed neatly made with an old quilt my mom had given me years ago. It struck me how impersonal the space was, yet tonight, it would be Walter's haven. When I came back downstairs, I found Walter still standing in the living room, his bag clutched tightly in his hands. He looked out of place, almost as if he were afraid to touch anything. "You can set your bag down," I said, handing him the towels and blanket. "The spare room's upstairs, first door on the left." He nodded and took the items, his hands trembling slightly. "I appreciate this," he said quietly. "It's no trouble," I replied, though the knot in my stomach suggested otherwise. "There's a bathroom next to the guest room if you want to freshen up. I'll be in the kitchen if you need anything." While Walter got settled, I busied myself in the kitchen, heating up some leftover soup and slicing a loaf of bread. The clatter of dishes felt oddly loud in the quiet house, and I found myself wondering again about the man upstairs. Who was he really? What was he running from? Walter reappeared a few minutes later, his hair damp and his face freshly washed. He had changed into a clean shirt, probably the only one he had, and looked less weary, though the weight in his eyes remained. "Soup's ready," I said, motioning for him to sit at the table. He ate slowly, savoring each bite as if it were a rare delicacy. "This is good," he said after a while, his voice almost shy. "Glad you like it," I replied, watching him carefully. For a moment, the silence between us felt comfortable, like the kind you share with an old friend. But then Walter spoke again, his voice tinged with something I couldn't quite identify. "Not many people would have stopped tonight," he said, his gaze fixed on his bowl, "let alone invite me into their home." "Well," I said, choosing my words carefully, "I figured you could use a break. Everyone deserves that much." Walter looked up at me then, his eyes sharp and searching. "You're a good man, James," he said, almost to himself. "Better than most." The words unsettled me, though I couldn't say why. The next morning, I woke to the sound of birds chirping outside my window. It was a rare, calm moment, the kind I hadn't experienced in what felt like weeks. For a moment, I forgot about the previous night's events, the late drive, the rain, and the stranger sleeping in my guest room. But as I made my way downstairs, the reality of Walter's presence came rushing back. The house was unusually quiet, save for the faint creak of floorboards in the hallway. I found Walter in the kitchen, sitting at the table with his hands folded in front of him. He was staring out the window, lost in thought, his shoulders hunched, as if the weight of the world rested on them. "Good morning," I said, breaking the silence as I entered. Walter turned to me, offering a small nod. "Morning," he replied, his voice gravelly but calm. "I hope you slept all right," I added, opening the cupboard to grab a mug. "Better than I have in a long time," he admitted, though his tone carried a somber undertone. I poured myself a cup of coffee and set another in front of him, which he accepted with a quiet, "Thank you." There was a strange energy in the room, something unspoken, heavy, yet strangely intimate. As I sat across from him, I noticed Walter fiddling with the edge of his mug, his fingers tracing the rim absently. His face was drawn, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion, and something else, regret maybe. "James," he began suddenly, his voice breaking the stillness, "I need to tell you something." I tensed slightly, the tone of his voice setting off alarms in my mind. "What is it?" I asked cautiously. Walter looked down at his hands, his fingers tightening around the mug. "I haven't been entirely honest with you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The words sent a chill down my spine. My mind raced with possibilities. Had I brought a fugitive into my home? A con man? Was I in danger? "What do you mean?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. Walter took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling, as though the confession itself were a heavy burden. "I lied to you last night," he said, meeting my gaze for the first time. His eyes, filled with sadness, seemed to plead for understanding. Walter leaned back slightly in his chair, his gaze distant as he began to speak. "I wasn't just some old man stranded on the highway," he said. "I put myself there, hoping someone like you would stop." My brow furrowed in confusion. "Why? What were you looking for?" He hesitated, the weight of his words visibly pressing down on him. "I was looking for a chance," he said finally. "A chance to make something right." I stared at him, unsure of what to say. Walter continued, his voice thick with emotion. "Years ago, I had a family," he said, his gaze dropping to the table. "A wife, 2 kids. We had a good life. At least it looked that way from the outside. But I was so focused on my work, so obsessed with success, that I let everything else fall apart." He paused, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the mug. "My wife left me first, took the kids and moved across the country. I tried to patch things up, but I was too late. By the time I got my priorities straight, they didn't want anything to do with me." I sat there in silence, the weight of his confession settling over the room like a heavy fog. "I spent the next few years trying to forget," Walter continued. "But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape the guilt. When my wife passed away last year, I decided it was time to stop running." Walter reached into the pocket of his coat, which was draped over the back of his chair, and pulled out a folded envelope. He slid it across the table toward me, his hand lingering on it for a moment before letting go. "What's this?" I asked, picking it up. "It's everything I have left to give," he said, "and I want you to have it." I opened the envelope cautiously, finding a stack of neatly folded papers inside. A quick glance revealed it to be a deed to a piece of property, along with a handwritten letter. "This property was supposed to be for my kids," Walter said, his voice heavy with regret. "But they don't want anything to do with me. I've been carrying this around, trying to figure out what to do with it. Last night, when you stopped for me, I realized that maybe it was time to give it to someone who might actually use it." I stared at him, stunned. "Walter, I can't take this," I said. "This is too much." "It's not about the property," he said, his voice firm. "It's about doing something good for once. Please, James, let me do this." I sat back, the envelope still in my hands, as a whirlwind of emotions swept through me. On one hand, I wanted to refuse. Taking something so valuable from a man who clearly had so little felt wrong. But on the other hand, the sincerity in Walter's voice was undeniable. You stopped for me when no one else would, Walter said quietly. You didn't know me, didn't owe me anything, but you still helped. That's more kindness than I've experienced in a long time. His words hit me like a gut punch. I thought about my own life, how often I let my worries consume me, how I'd grown distant from my family, how I sometimes felt like I was drifting without purpose. All right, I said finally, my voice steady. If this is what you really want, I'll accept it. Walter nodded, a faint smile breaking through the sorrow on his face. Thank you, he said simply. After our intense conversation, the rest of the morning passed in a surreal haze. Walter seemed lighter, almost relieved, as if unburdening his secret had lifted a weight off his shoulders. Still, a lingering sadness hung in the air, a reminder that his generosity came from a place of profound regret. I offered him breakfast, and though he politely accepted, I noticed he barely ate. His focus seemed elsewhere, his thoughts distant. After we finished, he stood up and said, I should be going. I've taken enough of your time. You don't have to leave so soon, I replied, though part of me wondered if it was the right thing to say. Walter gave a small, weary smile. I do, he said. There's nothing else for me here. But thank you, James, for everything. I walked him to the door, the envelope with the deed still in my hand. As he stepped onto the porch, he paused and turned back to me. Don't let the important things slip through your fingers, he said, his voice steady, but laced with an unmistakable urgency. Whatever you're holding back, whatever's been left unsaid, don't wait until it's too late. I nodded, the weight of his words pressing into my chest. I'll remember that, I said quietly. Walter reached out and shook my hand firmly, his grip stronger than I expected. Then, without another word, he turned and began walking down the gravel path toward the main road, his small bag slung over his shoulder. I stood there for a long time, watching him grow smaller in the distance until he disappeared entirely. After Walter left, I returned to the kitchen and placed the envelope on the table. I stared at it for what felt like hours, the words he'd said echoing in my mind. Don't let the important things slip through your fingers. Finally, I unfolded the papers inside. The deed was legitimate, a small, modest piece of land in the countryside, along with a modest savings account tied to the property. It wasn't a fortune, but it was substantial enough to make a difference. Then there was the letter. It was handwritten, the ink slightly smudged in places, as though he'd rewritten it several times. Dear James, it began, I don't know much about you, but I know you are a kind man. You stopped for me when you didn't have to, and that tells me everything I need to know about your character. This property was supposed to be a gift for my children, a way to make up for all the mistakes I made as a father. But they don't want it, and I can't say I blame them. I've spent my life running from my failures, hoping for a chance to start over. Meeting you has reminded me that kindness still exists in the world, and it's given me hope that this gift can bring someone else the happiness I failed to create for myself. Please accept this, not as payment or charity, but as a symbol of gratitude for stopping, for listening, and for giving an old man a moment of dignity. Sincerely, Walter. I read the letter twice, the words sinking in deeper each time. It wasn't just a gift. It was a redemption story, a way for Walter to make peace with the choices that had haunted him for decades. I thought about the photos on my walls, the calls from my sister I'd ignored, the birthday card for my father still sitting in a drawer, unsent. Walter's warning echoed in my mind. Don't wait until it's too late. That night, I picked up the phone and called my sister. "Hey," I said when she answered. "I just wanted to check in. I know we haven't talked much lately, but I'd like to change that." She hesitated, clearly caught off guard. "I'd like that too," she said finally, her voice soft. In the weeks that followed, I began making small but meaningful changes in my life. I reconnected with family, reached out to old friends, and even started volunteering at a local shelter. Walter's story stayed with me, a reminder of the ripple effects that even small acts of kindness can have. As for the property, I decided to visit it one weekend. It was a simple plot of land, with a small weathered cabin and a field that stretched out toward the horizon. Standing there, I felt a strange sense of connection, not just to Walter, but to the idea of starting over, of finding purpose in unexpected places. Walter's gift had been more than just land or money. It was a second chance, a wake-up call to live intentionally and cherish the things that truly mattered. I never saw Walter again, but I think about him often. His words, his actions, and his gift left an indelible mark on my life. Sometimes I wonder where he ended up, whether he found the redemption he was searching for. But one thing I know for certain: the night I stopped for him wasn't just a random act of kindness. It was a moment of fate, one that changed both of our lives forever. Walter's story isn't just about redemption. It's a reminder that we all carry burdens, regrets, and untold stories. His actions taught me that it's never too late to make amends, to change the course of our lives, and to extend kindness to others. If this story resonated with you, think about the Walters in your own life, the people who might be searching for a second chance or a little compassion. Sometimes, the smallest gestures, like stopping on a rainy highway, can lead to the biggest impacts. Thank you for watching this story on Stories Unfolded. If it inspired you, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and if you've ever experienced a moment of life-changing kindness. Remember, a single act of empathy can create ripples that change lives forever.